There's a phrase that seems to appear anytime something really bad happens in the world. That phrase being, everything happens for a reason. We say it all the time, or we at least hear those around us say it all the time, especially when something really bad happens. And it sounds comforting and it can even feel kind. But I wonder, what are we actually saying when we utter that phrase? We're saying God planned this. We're saying God authored this pain, that God is controlling all of this for some purpose that you will find out later in life. And if that's what God does, then God is responsible for everything. For the floods, the cancers, the deaths of children, for starving people all over the world. All of it is somehow a part of God's will. And so then what does that actually say about who God is? I mean, just this week we had tons of rain and floods happening throughout Kerr County again, and even here in Austin, which reminds me of last year when floods swept through Camp Mystic, tragically ending the lives of 25 young girls and people that worked there. Devastated that community, devastated us. Really hurt parents who are still recovering, one of which is still looking for their child. And we watch the news in horror and we don't know what to say. And when people in pain search for words, they reach for things like everything happens for a reason, or God just needed another angel, or it was meant to be. These phrases seem to come to the surface when we are most vulnerable. When the cancer returns, when the job goes away, when depression sets in, when addiction takes someone you love. And in those moments, someone will eventually say, everything happens for a reason. And you wonder, does this actually help? Or does it just make God the author of the worst moments of our lives? But here's what I think is happening. We say these phrases because we want to help. I mean, deep down, it comes from a good place. This is what's been told to us over generations, and so therefore, this is what we pull from in those moments. We want to help, so we say everything happens for a reason. But really, we're also just trying to protect ourselves. Because if everything happens for a reason, if God is in control of all of it, then the world all just seems to make sense. Everything can be explained, and we're not helpless. But in doing so, the cost is extremely high. Because we make God responsible for all evil in the world. We turn God into a monster. And we tell people who are already drowning in their pain that it was on purpose. That's not comfort, that's cruelty dressed up as theology. It's a very dark way to start this morning, and so you might be wondering, where is all this going? If we look at this gospel story, Jesus is picking up where we left off last week, talking about scattering seeds into a field. And Jesus tells a story about an owner who, again, scatters good seed into a field, and all of a sudden, good things start to grow. But then in the midst of that, they notice some weeds. And so the people that are working in this farm come up to the owner of this story, and they say, "Did you do this? We saw you scattering good seed. Did you also throw out bad seed as well?" And the owner says no. He says no, an enemy has done this. Which I think is so important, because notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, I planted this to teach you a lesson later. He doesn't say, trust me, this is all part of some grand plan. And he does not say everything happens for a reason. He says, an enemy has done this. Which means that God does not author evil. That God doesn't micromanage suffering into existence to teach us some lesson. That God doesn't control cancer or suicide or floods. Those things happen because we live in a creation that is not yet fully redeemed. By human choice, by the brokenness we inherit, and by real evil in the world. But what matters most is that that's not where God leaves us. And how do we know that? Because when evil entered into the world, God did not stay distant. God entered into it. Jesus wasn't spared any of the suffering. He was betrayed and tortured and executed by the very evil he came to save and protect and defeat. That God's answer to suffering wasn't some type of explanation or story. It was his presence. And that the cross shows us God doesn't stand above our pain explaining it. He enters into it. God's promise at the very end of the story, we hear that at harvest time, God will sort it out. Justice will come, redemption will come, but it will come on God's timeline and not ours. And that's the difference that changes everything. That God is in control, but God is not controlling. That God doesn't script your suffering. God doesn't cause your pain for some hidden purpose, but that God is sovereign and God is trustworthy. And God will have the final word. It's not the same as explaining why bad things happen. It's actually better. It's a promise that God shows up in the midst of it. And that ultimately, nothing will separate us from God's love. So I want to offer you three things that change when we stop believing everything happens for a reason and start believing that God is in control, but God is not controlling. The first is you stop trying to explain someone else's pain. You don't have to find the silver lining. You don't have to figure out God's hidden purpose. Instead, you can just sit with someone and acknowledge their own pain and say, I'm so sorry you're going through that. You don't have to try to explain it or make sense of it. Just be present with them. You can also stop waiting for suffering to make sense before you grieve it. You can cry, you can rage, you can even be mad at God without feeling like you're betraying your faith. And grief doesn't need a reason, it just needs space. And lastly, you can stop carrying it alone. You can seek help, whether that's professional help with counseling or through a community, not because you're resisting God's plan, but because brokenness calls for action, and you're free to respond. And of the three, I recognize the first one is probably the hardest, to stop trying to make sense of it all. I know that when my wife is venting about her day, I have to check myself before I wreck myself. And I have to ask the question, are you venting because you want me to fix it or because you just want me to listen? And you can guess the amount of times I just want you to listen. It's almost always. But it's because when we see people we love hurting and suffering, we just want to fix it. We want to take away their pain. We want to make it better. And so we will do anything and everything we possibly can to make that pain go away. But the truth is, people don't need our explanations. They just need our presence. They just need to belong, to be able to sit in the dark and know they are cared for and loved. Not trying to make sense of it all, but just to be there. That's what showing up looks like. That's something that you can do today, this week, this very moment. To just be with someone. To stop explaining and start showing up. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be present with someone in the dark. Not fixing, not explaining, just be. That is everything. And that is the good news. Amen.